the single biggest factor affecting immigration today is this thing here, fear. This was actually, my future mother-in-law gave me this as my Christmas present. I don't really know why. When we think about bridging the divides on immigration, fear is really the first thing that we need to address, and the only thing that we need to address. How did you all feel on the morning of November 9, 2016, when it came to immigration? Depressed. Sorry? Afraid. It was not a great day, especially for people in Washington and in New York City and Boston. People were just bursting out crying in the middle of the street, and my staff were red-eyed. They didn't know what they were going to tell their baby girl children about the president. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear among immigrants. There was a lot of fear among the people who supported the opposing candidate, Hillary Clinton. Where did that fear come from? Many Americans themselves had fears, and that's why they voted the way they did. They're hearing things like this when you equate immigration with someone climbing over a wall, when America is referred to as a piñata, that people are just coming here and exploiting willy-nilly. The reason that people are so afraid is because they cannot understand what is happening around them, and they feel as though they don't have a say in what is happening. And this is very dramatic to really illustrate what white working class Americans in particular have been seeing. So this is the foreign-born distributed across the US in 1880, a long time ago. But you'll see it's a lot of purple and blue. So purple is Eastern Europe, Western Europe, blue is Eastern Europe, green is Canada. Canadians are immigrants too. And you can see where they're concentrated, but you can see mostly like down there in Texas, just a few dots of red, that's Latin Americans. As time wore on, you see the European populations booming. You see a few Asians settling in Hawaii. 1920, you start seeing a little bit of a change down in the South. Suddenly, a few more Latin Americans, borders are moving, whatever, people are going back and forth. But this is what happens in 1970 after the Immigration and Nationalities Act. Suddenly you see this vast decreasing population of Europeans and Canadians and a burgeoning group of Latin Americans. And they're not just in the South. They're in Chicago, they're in New York, they're in Washington State. And by 2000, this is what Americans are seeing happening all around them. And it's not just happening on the coast, it's not happening in the traditional places that you would think of. As you know, we have new gateway cities popping up all over the place. So the Dakotas are seeing tremendous increases in immigration. What do they know about immigration? What do they know about immigrants? But suddenly they're seeing refugees being resettled there and people moving there because of manufacturing and oil and resources and that kind of thing. And there's fear among immigrants themselves. My friend is an attorney, and one day he was at the courthouse last year, and he saw a plainclothes police officer, ICE officer, in the courtroom, incidentally speaking Spanish to these Brazilian women, but he was there to take one of them away. There's a tremendous amount of fear among immigrants, documented or not. I was feeling afraid. I was in the process of getting my green card when the election happened. And I didn't know what on earth was going to happen. Did I make a mistake on my taxes? Am I going to get in a fight somewhere? I have a really hot temper. Anything could have happened. And anything could have derailed my own experience, much less for the people who didn't have authorization. As you know, going into courtrooms, 200% increase. They're waiting outside of churches in Fairfax, Virginia, during a winter storm. They waited till the storm was over, and homeless people were coming out of the church and other people who needed help, and they rounded people up. There's tremendous fear. And there's fear used as a political tool. And it was used most effectively in the last election by the man who became president and sits in the highest office of this land. Just stoke some fear and you get people to vote for you. Play into their insecurities, play into what they don't know about, and you tell them what you think they should know about it, and they will vote for you. And this is what ends up happening. Blind, quote, patriotism, wanting to reclaim their land, who deserves to be here, and signs like this. How did America become this way? Why are we in this place when we have more educated people than ever before, more people in college? It's fair. So, we try to combat that with facts. I am from the Immigrant Learning Center in Malden, Massachusetts. We're just north of Boston. That's our center there. We started out in 1992 as a free ESOL program, a place where immigrants and refugees can come to learn English for free. We've been doing that for 27 years now. We've served over 10,000 immigrants with an English immersion, very intensive 15-hour-a-week program. We have 5 levels of ESOL, 4 levels of literacy, family literacy, a theater program, a computer program, civics classes, citizenship classes, and even an ESL for entrepreneurs class, because as we know, immigrants are highly entrepreneurial. Then September 11th happened, and attendance in classes dropped by 50%. Students were afraid to come to classes because people were actually yelling things at them in the street. Go back to where you come from, we don't want you here, you look like a terrorist. So we knew we needed to do something. Beyond educating immigrants themselves, we thought we would educate Americans on who immigrants are and the actual kind of impact they were having. So we started this public education institute that I now lead, and this is our founder, Diane Portnoy. She doesn't look like an immigrant, does she? But she actually is a refugee. And we wanted to find out what was the other side of the story. We were one of the first institutes to actually push the narrative of immigrants as assets, because we looked at the data and we saw, wow, look at that. Immigrants enrich this country and always have. They're a net gain to us, even refugees. It takes a lot of work to filter that into people's minds, but that's what we found. So we started educating Americans, and we started getting the facts out there. And we even launched a research institute at George Mason, as I mentioned, the Institute for Immigration Research. You can actually request free fact sheets from them. They turn them around in about 5 days or so. And what are the facts? We know that immigrants are still learning English. Our waiting list has exceeded 1,000 people many, many times. Immigrants now are the most highly educated that we've ever had. More immigrants are coming here with bachelor's degrees. I saw a report just the other day, undocumented immigrants, the most educated undocumented immigrants we've ever received. We need immigrants because they are the ones giving us population growth. They are the ones who are revitalizing cities all across from Kansas City to New York City. Immigrants are responsible for the growth of these cities. We need immigrants because they're across the spectrum of occupations. It's not just maids and cleaners. It's software developers and engineers and math teachers. We need immigrants because our labor force is shrinking. If we don't have immigrants, we're going to have fewer workers. Why do we need fewer workers? Because some of the very people who voted in the current president and who want no more immigration will actually be depending on immigration for their Social Security checks. Who's paying into those? The immigrants and the undocumented immigrants who are paying taxes. We need immigrants because they start businesses. The whole narrative of immigrants taking jobs is false, because overall, immigrants create more jobs directly by their own businesses and by expanding industries. They've always done that. It's not a new phenomenon. Who here owns a pair of Levi's jeans? Thank an immigrant. Who here uses Google? Who here does not use Google? Thank an immigrant. Carnival Cruise Lines, Kraft Cheese, TJ Maxx, all founded by immigrants. Immigrants and crime, big false narrative. Places where there are higher concentrations of immigrants have less crime, less crime. Over the decades, studies have found that. So we pushed all that out there, and then what happened? We realized nothing was happening. It was just a fantasy. We put all these facts out there, all this research, and especially in the past maybe 5 or 6 years, there's been a ton of research from all over looking at immigrants and their contributions and their impact. And it was just a fantasy. Why was it a fantasy? Because they tried and tried and tried. John McCain, Ted Kennedy, they died. And we still have not had any sort of immigration reform. And then we end up with this. Funding for immigration research generally plummeted even before the election, because organizations, Knight Foundation, Kaufman Foundation, realized that it was not having any impact. And of course now, we don't need facts to guide our policy. We just need to come up with something. What does Stephen Miller have to say? Let's do that. Let's put kids in cages and separate families. That's a good thing to do. No. The fact is, most Americans don't know squat about immigration. About half of Americans actually believe that most of the immigrants here are illegals. About half of Americans think that. And the undocumented population is so far less than that. And of the people who voted for the current president, what was the biggest issue for them going into general election? Opioids, drugs, jobs, coal mines? No. It was the other. It was immigrants. Even in places that don't have immigrants, immigration was the biggest issue for them. Incidentally, if you look at the chart, terrorism was number 2 for them. And of course, as we know, those two things are conflated deliberately all the time. The fact is, we need to find out who are the people we're talking to? Who are the people we need to convince? And an organization called More in Common, which started out in Europe looking at the rise in xenophobia there, came to the US to see, well, who are the people that we're dealing with? And they found something that was really, truly remarkable. These are the hidden tribes of America. You have, on one side, progressive activists, followed by traditional liberals. So the progressive activists tend to be, they are the Bernie supporters. Younger, highly engaged, very secular, very cosmopolitan, and angry. Traditional liberals, older, many of them are retired. They're rational. They're open to compromise. Think of the Bill Clinton type of liberal. And they're also cautious. They're not willing to go in one extreme or the other. Passive liberals, unhappy, insecure, distrustful, politically disengaged. Sometimes we think about them as the middle, or generally the people who just don't vote. A lot of them are young. Many of them are low income. Think of the people who can't get jobs because they fail drug tests. They're very detached. They consider themselves, however, patriotic. And incidentally patriotic and also conspiratorial. So they may be the ones who believe in pedophile rings out of pizza shops, as happened a few years ago. Then we have moderates, engaged, civic-minded, middle-of-the-road Americans. They tend to be more Protestant. Conservatives, traditional conservatives. Think of the John McCain type conservatives. Religious, middle class, again patriotic, and moralistic. And then we have the opposite to progressive activists, devoted conservatives. The study found that they were tended to be white, retired, highly engaged, uncompromising, patriotic. So not just the Fox News people, the Alex Jones people. And I would argue that most of them are not even retired. There are many young people who fall into that category as well. So what is interesting, one of the things that's interesting is what they categorize as the exhausted majority, the middle group, and the wings. You see only 8% in the wings over there, and 25% on this side. What do they think about immigration? Is it good or bad? Of course, progressive activists, 99% say it's good. Devoted conservatives, no, not so much. But what I want you to focus on is politically disengaged. They fall further that way. Well, this way. They fall further toward the right. Impact of immigration, sort of 50-50 overall. Again, you see progressive activists, 99%, Devoted conservatives say immigration is just about costing the welfare system, using up resources. Politically disengaged, again, they're more to the right. DACA. How many people think that undocumented immigrants who arrived as children should be protected from deportation? Politically, even Hispanics, 25% of them said they should be deported. Roman Catholics, 36%. Strong Republicans, 67%. Protection of rights. The idea, again, of white working class Americans feeling as though they are not part of the decision making and not part of they don't have a say in what's happening. Percent of people who think that immigrants have more rights, more protection than the rights of Americans. 53% of white Americans think that is so. Disengaged, more than 50%, 62%. Devoted conservatives on immigration, devoted conservatives, people who go to church every Sunday, least likely to believe that someone seeking refuge should be given that refuge in this country. These are the things that Democrats are talking about. American, family, country, community, in their echo chambers, these are the words that are resounding. And when you go on social media, as everyone is going on now, and you go on the news media, where everyone is going to, MSNBC versus Fox News, these are the things that they're hearing. But for conservatives, it's not about morals. It's not about ethics. It's not about sanctuary. It's not about safety. It's about law and order. It's about rules. At the end of the day, this country has rules that we need to follow. That is the lens that they see it through. Then you have, slightly more extreme than that, Trump. And wall, security, crime. These are the words that his supporters are hearing, and these are the words that he's throwing out there. The one thing that Donald Trump does really well is he's good at repetition. He's good at simple words and repeating them over and over. And generally they work in his favor. He was saying Russia, Russia, Russia all the time, such that we couldn't think about Trump and not think about Russia. Somehow he was able to put that no collusion in there and somehow got validation. Well, thinks he got validation. So, one of the most important findings actually from Dr. Guest when he went to Youngstown was that anti-immigrant sentiment is much stronger than pro-immigrant sentiment. Of all the people who say immigration is their top voting priority, they are anti-immigrant, not pro-immigrant. And think about that for a second. You think that you're doing a great job, you're going to the protests, you're going to the rallies, you're calling up your congressperson, but the other side is doing a hell of a lot more. So if we have to bridge the divides in the immigration debate, we need to recognize one thing that's really important. The extremes are growing, and the middle is diminishing. It's not expanding. More people are flocking to either the left or the right, and more likely the right. Both race and economics play a role in what's driving people to the right. It's not that it's simply, oh, they're racist. They're looking, what we found in 2016 was that people voted on social issues, not economic issues. And immigration was a huge social issue for them, where they saw not immigration as an economic thing, but about immigration as taking away American identity. For the more uncommon people, they surveyed what are the key things to American identity, and one of the biggest things was to be white. For change to take place, we need to build broad local support. We have to go locally because we can't go federally. Nothing positive is happening there. We need to have conversations with people. We need to get localities on board with immigrants being positive and being good and being our neighbors and being our friends and co-workers. We have to connect with working class Americans, particularly white working class Americans. What could possibly connect with them? I'll tell you in a minute. But we also need to go back to the basics. You saw that chart about where Almost half of America thinks that it's only illegals coming here, and that is not true. We need to step way back and go back to some very, very basics. Americans don't know anything about immigration. Most immigrants don't know much about immigration. They know about their own, their H-1B or their TN visa or whatever it is. They don't know anything else. You have every letter of the alphabet in terms of visa categories, followed by numbers. So, yeah, it's exponential. People don't know. People don't understand. The idea of a line has been pushed so much. Most Americans do believe there's a line. They don't realize that a Mexican can take 20 years to get a green card, or a Filipino. So, my institute, after the election, realized that we were doing something wrong. We realized that facts alone were not working. We realized that talking to people, just putting stories out there, was not working. We needed to frame. After the election, we had a knee-jerk reaction, and we hosted a webinar 2 weeks before Christmas, which was kind of stupid, but we got a huge turnout, and it was called using immigration data to advance change. And a lot of people attended, and a lot of people spoke on how they use data to get policies. And over the holidays, I realized, no, that alone can't work. So we totally shifted our focus away from facts and data toward the narrative. How do we take back the immigration narrative? How do we reframe immigration as something positive, as something that's not scary, as something that is good for Americans, as something that Americans can actually connect with? What we discovered was that, unfortunately, we can't just go out there and talk about immigration and everyone is going to receive it and be like, oh, okay, so immigrants are good. Their minds are not blank slates. People's minds are more like swamps. They are filled with all sorts of conflicting ideas. They believe that America is a nation of immigrants, but they also believe we should secure the border. They believe that everyone should be given an opportunity to fulfill their potential, but they also believe no path to citizenship for DACA kids. They have a lot of conflicting views, and they've been fed all these messages about immigration as a zero-sum game. But someone coming here, and that automatically means that an American is denied something, that something is taken away from you by someone else. Zero-sum thinking. There's a lot of fatalistic thinking that we ourselves, as people who support immigrants, as advocates and as researchers have been doing, talking about the broken immigration system. It sounds very fatalistic, as something that cannot be fixed. And it's laws, it's rules, it's guidelines, it's policies. We do that every day in Washington. We can fix things. So this is what is going on in people's heads. They have this, punitive things that, if we separate families, well, maybe that will show them and it'll stop the flow. As we see, it has not stopped anything. Immigrants are still coming here because they believe things are going to get worse. But you also have humanist sort of thinking that, everyone deserves some sort of safety, some sort of security, no one needs to live in fear. We have a pragmatic sort of thinking. Well, if someone is here and they work hard, that's okay. I'm okay with that. But data alone does not work, especially in this day and age where you could put an incontrovertible fact out there that immigrants are starting more businesses than native-born Americans. Well, that probably means that native-born Americans are not getting the chance to start their own businesses. People can actually interpret facts in the most ridiculous ways and believe it. Because again, their mind is not a blank slate. They're seeing it through their own lens of what they've been fed. So we can't just put stuff out on Facebook and say, look, this story shows that immigrants revitalized Main Street in so-and-so place. It doesn't just lead to an epiphany. We have to have some kind of formula, some way of reaching people. So I'm going to give you, this is based on a lot of research from various places that we've sort of collected over the years as we've looked at the immigration narrative. The first thing is to acknowledge that this does not help. At every single debate or conversation or workshop, someone always says, Well, it all boils down to racism. That does not help. That shuts people down, makes people not want to listen to you. It does not in any way allow us to connect with people. So, what we need to do is we need to act fast, we need to act now, and we have to be in this for the long haul. The idea about immigrants and crime, we've been fed that for decades. Immigrants taking jobs, fed that for decades. Immigrants not assimilating, fed that for centuries. Italians, Irish. Deep canvassing, deep conversations, whether it's online or in person, keep it local. You need to get diverse allies, more than just immigrants speaking. You need to get white people talking about immigrants too, employers talking about how if they didn't have immigrants, they would not have their factory or their store or their grocery or their supermarket or their restaurant. I'm always amazed at every restaurant in Boston, no matter how high-end, no matter how French or Italian or fusion, it's always Spanish, Latin people making the food for us. Everywhere. North End in Boston, all Italian, nope, they're not the ones making the food. And there's strength in numbers and perspectives and origins. People who are coming out to speak about immigrants, they have to come from various places, and that's when people start to wake up. So it's not just a brown person telling you that immigrants are good. It's also a white person. It's also a pastor. It's also a business person. It's also your neighbor. The onus is on us to do a lot of hard work, because and I very aptly draw reference to the anti-abortion movement. They've been working at it for years and years and years, and pushing all these words, the fetus and tissue, and all these heartbeat bills and whatnot. And now they're having the most amazing success they could ever had. Messaging and concerted efforts over a very, very long time. So we need to emphasize shared values, what we have in common with people. We need to give people an explanation, because Americans don't understand how it works. They can feel sorry for one DACA person, but they don't get it. And we need to provide solutions. As simple as those solutions can be, if people don't have solutions, they don't know what to do about it, and they're left sort of dangling as to what can be done. We need to utilize something called frames. My background is in journalism, and the easiest way to explain what a frame is cop shoots an unarmed man. He happens to be black. The cop happens to be white. You put that within the frame of police brutality. It's an easy way for people to understand something. It's not just an isolated, discrete incident. It falls within this bigger frame. So most Americans, and we're not talking about the wings, but most Americans have certain shared values. Treating other people with dignity. We're not countries that behead people or conduct genocide. We're not places that, well, we weren't up until recently places that put kids in cages. So we have certain American values of treating people with dignity and respect and compassion. The frame of pragmatism. Logic, use logic, common sense. We can fix things. The immigration system is not broken. We have practical solutions to things that do not involve buses transporting 11 million people across the border into a place they may or may not have known. And shared prosperity. The idea that everyone who is here and working and contributing benefits everyone else. It's not an immigrant community thing and an American community thing. It's that your neighbors, your co-workers, everything has an effect. You have more immigrants in your community, you're more likely guaranteed a social security check than not. So lead with values. When you're having a conversation with someone, talk about the things that matter to them. Talk about ways that can resonate with them. Well, I think we can all agree families shouldn't be separated. That's a good place to start, right? This tips the argument away from an us versus them. It makes it more of a fundamental kind of basic argument that, okay, I agree, everyone should have X, Y, and Z. This can work especially with dreamers, not tearing apart families. Be logical, talk common sense, talk about things that just make sense to people, that vitriol and name-calling and rapists and criminals and Mexicans and young people with calves the size of cantaloupes because they're transporting drugs over the border, That kind of talk has no place in policy and no place in determining how people live their lives. Highlight that better immigration policies have a wider benefit. It benefits not just the immigrant, it benefits everyone else. We have more people working, more people paying taxes, more people bringing dragon dancing and limbo dancing and different kinds of food and enriching our country. When you encounter resistance, pivot to pragmatism. A moral argument may not work for everyone. They may say, well, you know what? I still don't think those people should be here, but let's appeal to pragmatism then. That, okay, well, they are here, what do? We have given all these dreamers years and years of education. Does it really make sense to send them somewhere else when they could go and get jobs and work for us? No. We have to keep reminding people that it's not just about other groups, it's about all of us. So standing up for what's right, opportunities for families, that those things are not just for certain people, they affect everyone. So there's a great film, I forget the name of it, I think the BBC did it, looking at a small town in Washington State where the police chief was all ready to deport all the immigrants, and he did. And the documentary focused on this topic, but they didn't speak to a single immigrant. They spoke to the co-workers, the students who lost their star soccer player. They spoke to employers who lost their employees. It was called The Missing. That's what it was called. And suddenly everyone saw the effect of, well, if these people are not here, we truly lack something. We truly miss out on something. Appeal to shared prosperity. I mean, you can follow this formula of, this is why we value everyone having an opportunity because it benefits everyone. By the way, if we give everyone an opportunity, that means we're treating them with some sort of compassion and respect. It'll enhance everyone's economic standing. It'll bring all of us forward. And this is what we can do to create those better policies, have some sort of solution. Focus on the whole. One interesting finding was that Americans don't extrapolate, especially empathy, from the individual to the whole. So they may hear a story about a dreamer and say, oh, well, Maria, she deserves a chance, but the rest of the Salvadorans here, I don't know about them. Jorge, my gardener, is a good family man, but I don't think all the Guatemalans are like that. People don't extrapolate to the whole. So somehow we have to emphasize, and when we tell our stories, we have to put the individual within this bigger context. So use storytelling not just to tell one individual's sob story. That person is part of a bigger picture, bigger community, and a bigger immigration problem that can be fixed. And because Americans don't know squat about immigration, they will not know what the solution is. So we need to give them something to work with. Say, okay, at the very least, let dreamers stay here and finish school. Let them get their high school diploma, let them go to community college, let them get a driver's license. We think that's just fair. What do you think about that? And someone might say, well, yeah, that seems to make sense. Give them some sort of solution. Otherwise, they enter into fatalistic thinking about, well, I don't know what could be done about that. I guess the immigration system really is broken. What do we do? Just break it down. A couple other points. Americans don't like it when you talk to them about immigrant rights. It's kind of funny because this is a land of liberty and all that stuff, and everyone should have some sort of right. But they get very defensive when you talk about immigrants having rights. Well, what rights do they have? They came over here illegally, and they expect to get something from us. They expect to have some sort of rights. Remember that graph I showed about how many Americans believe immigrants get more protections than Americans have rights? So you can't talk about immigrants in terms of rights. That gets people very upset and very defensive, and they're not going to want to listen to you after that. Maria, as I mentioned, dreamer, not every story needs to be like this, where you focus on one person. People don't spread out their empathy. And that's what you want people to do. To say, well, she is part of a bigger community, and I feel about them the same way I can feel about Maria. So studies have consistently showed that trying to get a policy change and people to change their minds explicitly through empathy does not work. Never repeat the myths. If you keep saying, I'm not a crook, I'm not a crook, I'm not a crook, people will probably end up associating you with crook. So one of the big faults of a lot of organizations, including my own, is to come up with like one of those myth versus fact sheets. And you have, myth, immigrant take jobs. And then you have fact. And the fact is about 4 paragraphs long. And it's full of data and research and citations and explanations. Believe it or not, people are much more likely to remember the myth than to remember the fact. The myth is short, it's sweet, it sticks in your head. The facts are much longer, much more complex. So whenever you're refuting a myth, never repeat it as much as possible. Immigrants take jobs. No, immigrants are entrepreneurial. Go down Main Street, see how many nail salons and restaurants there are. They create jobs. As opposed to, no, immigrants don't take jobs. You reinforce in people's minds the myth, and that's what sticks. And a couple things that I think we need to rethink and redefine. There are a lot of things the whole reason that I'm here is because there are so many things that we have to redo. We have to go back to our communications, we have to go back to our research, we have to go back to all the things that we've done and look at it differently now. Because things are different. This is not pre-2016, it is post-2016. A lot has actually changed. Policies and rules have changed. People's lives have changed. And people's mentalities, the exhausted majority, middle America, they are flocking to one of either end and more likely to the right. So simple things like coming out of the shadows. Immigrants need to come out of the shadows. We want them to come out of the shadows. What lurks in the shadows? Monsters and boogeyman and zombie, Pennywise. So, rethink that entirely. Don't associate immigrants with anything in the dark. They are friends, they are neighbors, they are co-workers just like us. Broken immigration system, as I mentioned, it sounds like something insurmountable, which is why people voted for Donald Trump, because he was just going to break everything down and start over, which in effect he's doing. Immigration. People move. People move from city to city. I spoke to a classroom full of 5th graders. Has anyone ever moved? Almost everyone put up their hands. It's a natural thing. People move for different reasons to different places, but people have always done that. And lastly, immigrant. We host an annual Immigrant Entrepreneur Awards, which is a big gala, and we highlight life science businesses and neighborhood businesses and everything in between. And when we call chambers of commerce and banks to get nominations, more often than not, we hear, well, I don't think my client wants to be associated with that because of the word immigrant. It's kind of a bad word. Our whole mission has been to reclaim the word immigrant, and we refuse not to say the word immigrant, but we also need to associate immigrant with something else, as I mentioned. Friends, neighbors, hard workers, church-going, community members, volunteers, teachers, engineers, employers, employees, people. Those are the things we need to associate with immigrant. So fear is, frankly, a real weak tool, but it has utmost effectiveness. And that effect has taken shape in the terms of the past presidential election and may even shape the next one. Continuing my tradition of using F words, wait a second. I think that it's a really difficult thing to overcome, and that's why I say you need a lot of allies. It needs to be a concerted effort over many years to get people on board, but you have to keep it local. Keep it local, keep it contextual. What happens in Mississippi, in Missouri, as Domingo told me, is not the same as in Boston. Everything needs to have context. But that is a lot stronger than a weak attempt at stoking fear. And I think we are a lot of people in this room, and we have a lot of resources and networks and tools, and I think we can all agree that we have strength in numbers, and given the right tools, we can do anything. So, thank you.